Ursula Burns, it is great to see you. Thank you for joining a giant group of your fans today on Zoom. Where are you? Where are we catching you?
I am actually in New York City. I was supposed to be on this day until the end of next week in London, but I flew back for the funeral of Vernon Jordan earlier this month. And it's just hard to go back and forth for lots of reasons, which we'll talk about. But so I decided to stay until another week and then I fly back to London.
Well, we appreciate while you're stateside, you're making the time. Although I suppose you could, in theory, have done it late in the afternoon in London too.
That was the plan, Guy. That was the plan. That was the plan.
Well, as you know, your colleague Antoinette is a total rock star, and thanks to her, which I will express separately and elsewhere. But as in 18 years of working with the Technology CEO Council, there is no CEO I more admired, enjoyed, thought was high impact, and was a little bit frightened of, certainly frightened of disappointing than you. And when I learned that you had a book coming out, and we've been doing a lot of these discussions with people like Adam Grant, I reached out hoping that we could have a conversation. So I'd love to start with your book. Where You Are Is Not Who You Are. I have pre-ordered. Anybody else? It's available on Amazon and other bookstores for pre-order. I'd love you to tell us what inspired you to write it and who you hope to inspire in writing it.
So the book turned out to be a lot more accidental than you would think. I actually had never planned to write a book. That's not where my skill set is or my interest is. I'm a voracious reader, but I just don't write well. I'm an engineer, so complete sentences are hard for us guys. But whenever I spoke a lot throughout my career and the early part of my life, to students, to big groups, whatever, wherever I went. And at the end of a large number of these speeches, people say, you have to write a book. You have to write a book. You have to write a book. I say, yeah. And then I was speaking to a large group of CEOs in Europe after I moved there, and Vernon happened to be there. Vernon Jordan was there. At the end of that, one of the CEOs, we were in a group chatting at the end of the speech, and he said, you have to write a book. And I said, and Vernon said, yeah, you have to write a book. And I said, okay, fine. and basically from that okay, fine, came an editor, which somebody had in the audience had connected to me to, and a writer, and et cetera. So it came about by accident. And it's a really hard thing to do, Bruce. It's a really hard thing to write a book. My book is it's a memoir of my life. And as I say in the book, it's very difficult to write about your life because your life happens a day at a time in a very boring pace, right? It happens a day at a time. It's not, you don't start your life and say, well, we're going to put this scene together that's worthy of telling people in some kind of a story. But what happens is, so you live your life and people say, well, it's worthy to tell a story about, and you go, no, it's just a whole bunch of days. And what you have to do when you write a book is think about it from the end point back, not the way you live it. And for me, it was so difficult to do, to think about my life from where I am backwards in a sense that would make it exciting for people to read and engrossing for people to stay involved in. So it was very difficult. And then it's boring as well, because you're talking about yourself. You did it already, you lived it already. So what's the point of kind of building up a big story about it? So it took a long time. It took me probably 50% longer than they wanted it to take. And because of that, the pandemic happened. So you have to go back George Floyd happens. Donald Trump had already happened, but we were at the throes of the end of this. So I had to kind of incorporate all of that back into the book. And I'm hoping that it's at least readable. That's what my hope, that it's at least readable for you guys out there.
Well, I already bought it, but I'll see. I'm gonna keep my purchase, my scheduled purchase, because I know enough about your life to know, and I know you're a humble person, but it's a pretty fascinating story. Something you said there made me wonder. If I were writing a book and my target audience were students, I feel like I'd use a different voice and highlight different things. By contrast, if I'm speaking to CEOs, it's a whole different set of what matters and what was relevant. And I know you are eagerly sought out by both groups. How do you bridge?
The core is the same, Bruce. The core is the same. And, most of my management style, how I raise my kids, how I live my life is in these little blurbs that my mother used to tell me over and over and over and over again that I talk about consistently. It doesn't matter if I'm speaking to CEO groups, to groups of employees who work for me, students. And one of them is, who you are, where you are is not who you are. And she used to say, where you are is not who you are. And remember that when you're rich and famous. And so because when the context that she was saying it in, when she said it, we were not rich or famous. She didn't even know what rich and famous meant. We didn't even know what rich and famous meant. We were living in the worst conditions that you could possibly imagine in New York City, with very little money, very little money. My mother worked as hard as she could, but she had to always supplement her income with welfare or handouts or whatever it is. And we lived in a tough place. And we would walk, and she would say, this is not who you are. This happens to be where you are. That was one of her things. And then another one of her statements was, you have to leave behind more than you take away. That's going to be how you're going to be judged at the end of your life. That's how you're going to be judged when you walk to the gates of heaven. So make sure that you do that. And lots of other statements and sayings. And the book is about that, how it kind of permeates in your life, and how the message, at least for me, didn't change. If I'm speaking to young people, if I'm speaking to young people who don't know a thing, to CEOs who know everything, to business leaders, the soul of who I am and the approach that my mother taught me about life is consistent. And that's what the book is about. So I don't really change message often. I change examples, but not message.
Do you think if you were starting out today, how would you attack the world differently if you were starting out today?
Faster. And I would take significantly more risks. So do it faster, take more risks, and I would actually be a little bit more selfish and have more fun. So let me start with the last one. One of the things that I kind of happened my way into was having two children. I only had one, but I ended up raising two children. And that was a mistake. If I would have thought about it more, or if I would have known when I was making the decision about family, if I would have known then what I know now, I would have had 6 children, 7 children. I would have had a lot more children, because it turns out that most of the joy and a lot of the sorrow, but most of the joy in my life has come out of these 2 people. And, I don't want to get too emotional, but it's not spectacular every day. It's just great most of the time. And I just think that it probably would have been better to have not 2, but 3 or 4 or 5. And that's one. I would have done that. Second is I would have taken a little bit more risk. I took a lot of risk, but the downside of making a mistake generally, particularly early in your life, is not that great. So, and I was so cautious when I was launching my life, right? When I was picking a college, picking a career, where I would live, I was so cautious that things ended up okay, but I think I would have seen more, done more, and had more fun if I would have taken more risks, if I would know now how in the early parts of your life, how unimpactful some of the things that you do are. And how in a later part of your life, how impactful they can be, and then you have a lot less flexibility. And then having more fun. This is something that for sure, I was so serious when I was growing up. I was so focused, so intent on things, so critical of myself and making things perfect. And you had making good choices, and kind of always wrapped up in in your head about what's going on, to try to plan that I did so little living. I did a lot of living, guys. So it's not like I was a total dum-dum, but what I know now is I would have just kind of let loose earlier and had a lot more fun and been more impactful.
Well, so first, I wouldn't be too hard on myself if I were you. What you've described, I think, is a pretty common progression where people are heads down and in a hurry and super serious, and then look back. But something you just last said is really interesting. I assume you knew Clayton Christensen and you read his book, How Will You Measure Your Life?
Absolutely. And he came to speak to us at Xerox more than once. But
Well, so I mean, am I wrong, or what you're describing is very much uh, people go from focused on the currency of accomplishment to the currency of purpose, and particularly you see this with CEOs, perhaps, who make it through their very first tour.
and it's unfortunate that we have to become a CEO before we can enjoy it. But it's something. It is exactly Clay Christensen's mantra. By the way, I had it before I read Clay, but he was so perfect in stating it.
Yeah.
And this idea of purpose nowadays, one of the things that I love so much about the life that I'm living right now is that I don't give a damn about what people think. So it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, my kids, I care about what they think. My brother, my sister, maybe, Vernon, I would have, but the rest of the world out there, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Obviously, you earn your way to that. You can't start out in the world saying, I don't give a hoot. But I was there sooner than I thought. And I was still cautious, I think, for years after I could have been. You know what I mean? I was still cautious. And it's just, now I know that I'm not dumb. I'm not, that I have valuable things to say, and about a lot of things, not just about running a company, not just, about the things that you would think that I should be expert in. I have valuable things to say, and at least they'll start a conversation. So I'm now a lot more free and confident that I understand the downside, and that it's not going to be that big a deal on the downside.
Well, look, I think there's a word for after a career and years and decades of absorbing and learning and having these kind of insights. It's called wisdom. And it's hard to get in your 20s, but like you said, as a voracious reader, and as somebody who listens, and you were one of the best listeners I've ever worked with, not to me, but to just, you often would observe something that I was too busy trying to control the situation, and I missed what actually happened. And you were always great at helping to fill me in on what should have been my job. Let me ask you, if I can, because you do talk to lots of CEOs, and they're smart for seeking you out. Increasingly, CEOs believe they need to engage on policy, on social issues, and societal issues, I would say. Some of that is maybe that they're trying to have purpose and impact. Some of that is frustration that the policy-making world, the elected officials, are screwing things up. They're not dealing with climate. They're not dealing with cyber. They're not dealing with systemic racism. Some of that is that in 1975, 17% of a public company's value was intangibles. Now it's 90%. That's your people. That's your data. That's your software. That's your brand. And as you take a look at this environment where CEOs are sort of the new fifth estate, do you advise CEOs to do it because that's the way to attract and retain employees, because that's the way to have a brand that customers want to associate with, or because they're going to get to a point in life and this would be a regret if they failed to lead?
I think I'm going to say all of that, but I'm going to start a little bit further back. Companies are buildings, technology, all of this products. Fundamentally, they're people, and basically they're a whole bunch of people, and they generally want to interest a whole bunch of other people. That's all it is. And the idea that we could be the leader of an enterprise of 50,000, 100,000 people, and not kind of participate in the world fully as a leader has always been one of these odd things. Michelle worked for me for a long, Michelle Kahn, worked for me for a long time. It's always been one of these dichotomy. we actually have to participate, but we really can't have an opinion. We have to lead, but we really can't engage them. We can't have an approach or a point of view. And it seems to me that it's always been difficult for me to figure out, how does that work? It just doesn't make any sense. So it has always been a responsibility of business leaders to have a point of view about things. How you express it, when you express it, how forceful you express it, you got to kind of be just like anything. You can't be a bull in a china shop. But without a point of view, you cannot participate in the world in the context. So what's happened now, thank goodness, whatever the goodness is, fortunately, people are now starting to say, can you please tell me what your point of view is? Or they're saying, how dare you not have one? Tell me what do you think about social injustice? What do you think about the environment? What do you think about a woman's right to control her body? What do you think about China? What do you think? Whatever. Because not that necessarily what you think will carry the day, or necessarily that what you think is what your customer or your company would agree with, but you're a human with a whole bunch of humans. And the way that I think that we participate better is by interacting. And having to cut off a whole part of your head, a whole part of your vocabulary, a whole part of your interest, and walk into this place that you spend 80% of your time in. When I was CEO, 80% of my time, 90% of my time in, without any of that. I can't tell them what I think about this, can't actually talk too much about that. I think it has always been non-productive. Where we are today is that we've grown up and progressed in industry and society and in governments, so the world in general, where the problems are more complex than ever before, and no single entity can actually address them, figure out a solution by themselves. Now we are forced to have business leaders, government leaders, social justice leaders, religious leaders, whatever it is, regular old people engaged to try to figure out the more complex issues that we're dealing with today. So CEOs have to kind of come in with their company's point of view and their point of view, and contribute to the discourse, right? So that's really good and very useful. That's one reason why. Second is that some of the other institutions are just failing. They're not standing up. We've had a couple of years of poor government interaction in some of the most important things that we had to deal with: the environment, racial justice. We've literally had absenteeism, like absentee landlords. So, the world hates a void. So people had to fill in, and some of the stuff had to be filled in, because without it, literally we would have anarchy, and we know that doesn't quite work very well. So I think that there's complexity of problem, some failures in traditional institutions to actually gain and take over. And last but not least, we have a set of technologies in the world that make it unbelievably easy to create followership around anything, and to literally build an opinion about things, to just make up and build an opinion. Some of those opinions are good, some of those opinions are not good, not so good. So technology, all of these things come together, and it means that we all, priests and nuns and rabbis and business leaders and government leaders, have to engage to actually move the ball forward for some of the complexity that we have in the world.
It feels like when I speak with a lot of CEOs, they might agree with that statement broadly or generically, but the challenge becomes knowing when. So you got 50 states, they may all have laws. Congress have people introducing laws, and and their theory would be you were running a business, and things can and do get to a point where you then need to bring your voice and your energy, but it's not everything everywhere all the time. And in your role now advising so many CEOs, it feels like there is no formula. I keep trying. I'm me, so I keep trying
there
to
is
create
no
a flow
formula.
chart.
There is no formula. And one of the things about it's kind of, another one, it's like living life. There's no formula to living life, and part of running a business is living life. So you don't know for sure. You are exactly right. a lot of the discussions that I have a lot of discussions with business leaders now, which is really interesting because I used to be one, and and I didn't speak to other business leaders as much as, but I think it's just the times, right? It's the time it's easy to get in touch with people now. But I think the fact of the matter is that business is much like life. It's much like raising a family. You don't know exactly. So what I talk to business leaders about is a little bit about what they want to say, but more about when do they say it? How do they say it? It's not about, what I want to say. Some of it is on racial justice. Uh, Around the time of George Floyd, at the time of George Floyd, I was inundated with phone calls from business leaders. It was really very interesting. And in the beginning, I was like, don't you have somebody else to talk to? Why don't you call your board members? And why don't you call your friends? And it took me a very short time to realize that they didn't have a lot of board members that looked like me, none. And they don't have a lot of friends that look like me. So part of the recommendation to them was the following: get some board members and friends that look not like you. Right? It sounds like rocket science, but it really isn't, because when you are faced with something that's so foreign, that is so common to other people, you have to get educated really quickly. The best way to get educated is literally have some friends who can talk to you about it. Have a colleague who can talk to you about it. So we started this thing called the Board Diversity Action Alliance, all about one simple thing: diversity on the board. Get some other people to talk to you about the problems that you're dealing with, the opportunities that you're dealing with, the situations that you're dealing with, and the solutions that will probably be better. And so I want to go back to what you started with. This was not about generally it was not about what do I do or say. It's how do I do it? How do I say it? When do I say it? And some of it for things that are very foreign, like racial justice, particularly with non-US based companies, which I got a lot of calls from them. They just didn't get it. Part of it is context. You got to understand, you have to, I'm not the only person who can give this to you, by the way, because I only have one perspective as well, from the insider perspective. I have one Black female perspective. There are a lot of others that you have to get. But the point here is that it's really good and very smart that you didn't go on your own gut on this thing, because you would have been wrong. So get some other people together. I think leadership is all about that. This is about context, and one of my mentors would always say is perspective.
So that's good advice. And one question I ask myself, let alone I'm asked by those for whom I do work, is are folks doing enough or too much? And somebody who preceded you on one of these Wayne's World with Bruce conversations is my old college buddy, Melody Hobson. I think you know her.
Very well.
And we had a great conversation. And one of the, she's a lot of positive energy. One of her thoughts is, she says, we're at Civil Rights 3.0. And I said, what do you mean? She said 1.0 was the Union Army and Abraham Lincoln freeing slaves. 2.0 was Dr. King and the marchers and the brave news coverage to make it more well-known nationally. She says Civil Rights 3.0 is going to be led out of the C-suite. It's going to be led by business leaders, and because we're in this world now where everyone can be a witness and everyone can be a publisher and everyone can be an activist, there's more opportunity and greater expectation. You and she were among 72 African-American business leaders, though, to recently sign a letter saying, hey, get off your ass, corporate America. That Georgia law where you can't give water to people who are standing in line to vote and hot, that's your voice needs to be heard on that. And it looks like you're already having some action. Do you share her fundamental optimism that we're heading in the right direction, or are you worried that inertia in the post-Floyd era pulls us backward?
The only reason why I would worry about that is if I died. Because this doesn't happen by gravity. This happens because people on this Zoom cast, because other people who are interested, because the other 72 CEOs who signed the letter, because give up. If we give up, then we lose the fight. Right? If we give up. If we don't give up, we'll make progress. So I am very confident that we're just not going to give up. Melody is so right. I love the Civil Rights 1.0, 2.0. There's one fundamental thing that was consistent in all of those movements. That was a group of people, large group of people, who were not Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King, who were behind, underneath, pushing, driving for change. It wasn't this small group of Union Army guys who decided. They were the representatives and the army of the people who were crying for help, crying for change, some of them activating for change. And that happened in Civil Rights 1.0, 2.0, and it's happening right now. One of the reasons why businesses are so into this, how many times have we had a Black man murdered by the police? George Floyd was not the first guy. How many times have we had it on TV with film? Not the first guy. So why now is it getting such pickup? Because the voices, technology helps this, the voices are consistent and loud, and they are coming from all over the place, not just from the Black guys, not just from the Hispanic guy, all over the place. When George Floyd was killed, I was in London, and one of the largest marches I've ever seen in my life happened in Battersea Park in London. They don't even know who George Floyd is, and most of them haven't been to Minneapolis. So if they came to the United States, they went to New York, right? So, but they were out there, they were fed up they were fed up with the status quo, with this being the standard. And so underneath all of those movements, 1, 2, and 3, is a consistent set of people, large numbers of them who understand that what right looked like, and were willing to continue yelling until enough people picked up the banner to lead them through it. And that's what I think is going to keep us going. And what happened in Georgia, this was really interesting. This is, here we are living our lives. Everybody, the 72 or 78, I think it was, final CEOs, we're living our lives, and most of us doing pretty well. I mean, right? We're sitting in our little places wherever we are, and we get a call on a Sunday from one of us who was talking to another one of us. We get a whole bunch of people on the phone. And the question was, are we paying attention to what the hell is happening? And quite honestly, we were, but peripherally. And some of the people were paying intense attention. And we got educated really quickly and realized that this was like fundamental injustice. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the race you are, the gender you are. This has to do with whether or not you are an American. And why is it that everybody's kind of quiet about this? So we kind of tried to reach out and get some non-Black businesses, any business, most of the businesses are non-Black businesses, I mean large corporations, to kind of come up, and nothing. I'm working behind the scenes. And finally, the answer was basically throw your hands up and go, this is not about Democrat, Republican. This is not about Black or white or Hispanic or male or female. This is about America. If you're an American and you kind of do the stuff you're supposed to do, water should not be the determining factor of whether or not you can vote. Literally having a driver's license that's 2 months valid or whatever, some of these crazy things they're putting in, is not a determining factor of whether you should vote. But literally, when you start to see this becoming the factor, you realize that this is no longer a game, that these guys are serious about taking away the rights that people have, that the generations before us has earned for us. And that you can't sit still. You just can't. So you just have to create all kinds of mess and noise and muck and screw it up until people start to obey the laws, which means that when you're standing in line and it's 150 degrees, it should not be against the law for some guy to walk up and hand you water. If that's against the law, then we should arrest the guys who are arresting the guys who handed the water. It's just, it's so basic, Bruce. I get so worked up about this. How could we anyone possibly allow any one of these 16 things that these people are trying to do to stand? We should all be running to state houses and saying, you must stop.
So let me ask you about somebody you've mentioned now on the call twice, the late, great Vernon Jordan, who was both very much a figure of and a force within the establishment, yet also a great bridge for change and for racial justice. Seemingly it'd be hard to straddle, yet he was masterful at it. I didn't know him personally. My brother got to work with him a little bit at Aiken. I know he was on your board. I read lots of the obituaries, but I'd love any thoughts, about ultimately you think his the greatness of his legacy, and what all of us who maybe didn't know him as well might take away.
Yeah, so I'm gonna definitely not cry during this part, so I'm gonna slow down a little bit. And so Vernon still is, because I kind of haven't solidified exactly that I can pick up the phone and call him. But Vernon was an unbelievable, just bare-chested friend. Think about everything that you would need a friend to do, personally, professionally, good times, bad times, good you, bad you. Vernon was my very, very, very good friend. So, and he showed, by the way, I said this, that I was like special. Oh my goodness, he called, I met everybody who I've met that's really kind of high impact in the world, I met through Vernon, literally. I remember when I met him in 1990, he said, "Hey, I'm going to a meeting in New York. Why don't you come with me?" I said, "Me?" He said, "Yeah, come on." I met Bill Clinton. This is a pretty cool meeting. I met Barack Obama. I met all these people, Katharine Graham, literally just because he would just call up and say, "I'm headed somewhere. Come on." He was on my board. He watched me when he met me. He decided. The board had already decided that I had like some skill. So that's how come I could meet him. He decided that he would take special interest and special care of me. And that's in good ways and bad ways. I remember he would tell me about dressing. I remember I walked in one day and he said, this is gonna sound crazy, but he said, when I was growing up, most of the women wore hose, pantyhose. Yeah. He says, the women don't wear hose anymore. Do you think that's good for work or not? He was telling me I wasn't wearing hose and I should wear hose. He tried to do it in a nice way. And I said to him, hose is not something that you should have a conversation about with many women. So it works. So please put the hose, but by the way, only he could say it.
Right.
Only he could say it. He said, basically, I think all women, you should be wearing hose when you come to the board. Something from that simple to, in a meeting we were having, I said something that was wholly inappropriate without thinking about it. It wasn't like bad language or anything. It was actually me showing me instead of showing the team. And he, when I sat back down, he wrote me a note. He said, "We have to talk about that later." I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. And he recounted the situation to me and then told me how it could be perceived, how he perceived it, how it could be perceived, and how bad it would be if that were the standard that I used. He was just great, socially great. My husband was really ill. My husband passed away in 1991. 1991. In 2019, 2 years ago, January. And before he died, he was sick. He didn't die from any illness but he was sick and he was in the hospital for 21 days. And I was CEO in the middle of this like crazy, one of the crazy times in Xerox. We always had them, but this was, and somebody called him and told me my husband was in the hospital that day, right? It had just happened. And he called me and he said, "Ursula, your husband has the best doctors in the world. I know that. Your husband, and they're looking after him. He has you looking after him. So I am totally unconcerned about your husband." He said, "I'm concerned about you, and I want to make sure that you know," these are his words, "that I am looking after you." He called me every day, every single day. And every single day, different times, I was in the hospital, he'd say, "Hey, how are you doing?" I'm like, he was so consistent and so strong a friend that he became an example for me he became an example of how big a gap I had been to some of my friends, if you know what I mean. It was like, my God, I thought I was doing this pretty well, but then you realize, I'm like, goodness, no way. So he was a complete friend. And so I spoke at his eulogy and I got to the end, which is really, really well, because I had to practice it 100 times so I didn't start crying at the beginning. Because then it becomes totally useless, right? Because nobody can understand anything you're saying. And I ended by saying that, it's so hard to lose someone, but it's also so great to know someone that when you lose them, it's devastating. And that was Vernon to me. It's so amazing. He was so amazing an impact on my life. And then, by the way, Kim Cooper-Smith, the head of Aiken Gump, right? She got up and spoke, and she said the same exact thing. Ken Chenault got up and spoke and said the same exact thing. This guy literally surrounded them. He enveloped them, me, and a whole bunch of other people floating around in the world. And here I thought I was this guy, really special. I was special, obviously, but really special. He had 50, 60, 70 people that he just literally loved and took care of. So he was one of the real guys.
That's a wonderful, fantastic story. Both something great to know and remind me of my complete inadequacy as a friend. So for many people on this Zoom, sorry. Two last questions, and then I promised Antoinette I'd let you go, and I'll tell you them both up front. First, as somebody who really does understand and has seen leadership, I'm interested in who over the last 15 months has impressed you with their leadership. And then we always end these asking folks for, what gives you hope for the future and reasons for optimism, and you're not allowed to say the vaccines. So those are my last two teed up questions for you.
So the leadership is going to be strangely, will I get myself in trouble by saying this? Michelle would have, if she was still working for me, she would have probably said, don't ever say this. One of the people who actually impressed me over the last 18 months was Andrew Cuomo's handling of New York City in the vaccine, in the pandemic. I'm not generally a big fan of Governor Cuomo. I'm not necessarily a hater either, but yeah, I'm definitely on the fence. And I watched this man take control of an uncontrollable city, an uncontrollable state, but the whole state is the friggin' city. I'm sorry for everybody who lives up in Rochester and Syracuse and Buffalo and all that, but literally, if you can get Manhattan kind of lined up, Brooklyn lined up, and while he didn't do everything perfectly, his consistency and forcefulness during a time when you needed consistency and forcefulness was pretty amazing. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that are going on wrong around this thing, but that was one of the situations. I had flown in from London, and I got to tell you, I lived in a city that had exactly the opposite. London, literally, it's kind of like when I was living in London back then, when I was in London, I'm still living in London, but when I was there back then, you could tell an American because the Americans had masks on, everybody else didn't. You could tell an American because they stayed out of the shops. They basically stayed in their homes most of the time. Everybody was hanging out like there was no problem whatsoever. And the control and the impact that this guy had in the beginning of the pandemic, I think was impressive. That's one. The other one who I am secretly a fan of, and I've gotten to talk to a couple of times, and it's definitely a budding fanship, is Vice President Harris. I've spoke to her a couple of times before the election, and only one time after. And she has a plan, she has an idea, and her ability to continue to kind of progress it by getting a lot of different input has been very impressive to me. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know, but she's thinking about it and she's moving forward in that way. Second, what gives me hope? My young people. I'm around consistently 4 of them. My son, my daughter, and my 2 nieces. And they therefore pollute me with a whole bunch of all other people, young people just like them. They're friends, right? It's a little bit less than it used to be, but I get to talk to them, see them on Zooms. These people, this is 25 to 32-year-olds. I've known them for their whole life. They are a force to be reckoned with. Their knowledge, beliefs in themselves, their proper disdain for authority and proper respect for authority, their knowledge their articulateness, it's just amazing. These kids are me 10 years later, right? They're me when I was grown up, and they're running around. They have a point of view. They are not anywhere near as selfish as I thought you could be, right? Because these are fairly privileged four kids, and they're trying to fix it. They're trying to fix it. And in the beginning, they were just screaming at us saying, get out the way. That's what you guys are messing it up, just get out the way. Now they're fixing it, and it's a little bit more collaborative. And so I am really optimistic that for every bad image that I see on TV, which I don't watch a whole lot anymore, which is, thank God I haven't watched it a lot during the pandemic, but for everyone that you see embodied and however you see them embodied, there is at least one who counteracts them. And I think that on the average, it's not education only, it's not wealth, obviously. There are enough kids from a strata of life that actually have an idea about what the world should look like and how to help to progress it. And sometimes they're patient, sometimes they're not, sometimes they have couth, sometimes they have none, but they are at least thinking and engaged. And I'm really optimistic that what is it? What is it? Justice bends, the arc of justice bends.
The arc of history bends towards justice.
Bends towards justice. The arc of history bends towards justice. And I think we are definitely now, after 4 years of examples of lack of justice, it's activated, not only in the United States, guys. This is not a Trump only statement. Just in general, we've been able to see just such imbalance in how people are living and what they have access to. And it's so clear now, right? Because of the pandemic, it's so clear that we call a guy an essential worker today. And yesterday, we didn't care whether they were paid $5 an hour or $15 an hour. They're now essential. We have no idea what the hell they were paid before. We paid no attention to them before. Now you have to leave your house to take care of me. So I think the whole thing is starting to come now where we have to deal with some of this stuff. We have to talk about it. We have to make progress. I'm optimistic that we're not all stupid and that the young people are even smarter than the non-stupid adult people, and we'll make progress in the world.
Well, you've given me hope too, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also really grateful for your time. Ursula, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you all for listening to my ramble. And thank you. And I see Arthur Mehlman